Okay, we're ready to go. Huge crowd. What? Kathy's here? No. I'll come running, don't worry. 1, 2, 3, 4. We got enough then. Well, we're not going to vote on anything, are we?
Well, but we still need a quorum.
We got a quorum.
Yeah.
Okay. And
Or we can't keep minutes, right? Where's our minute taker?
Cindy went home sick today.
Oh, where's our backup?
She is also sick today.
I thought she was just up there.
She's lost her voice.
So to take notes from the YouTube video.
Yeah, Cindy will be watching the video to take notes.
okay, that's fair enough.
And I've already taken roll.
Okay, you've already taken roll. All right. So Kathy, you have our undivided attention. If you would like to go forward. I guess that's what we're doing, right? Right? Okay, go ahead.
Okay, as long as everybody's ready to go.
Yep,
Mayor and
we
city
are.
council members, this is in regards to the structural calculations requirement of the 2006 IBC. Structural calculations have been a requirement in the building department for the last 30 years. Below is a list of code requirements that can be reviewed by council to create an ordinance to exempt structural calculations during the review process per the 2006 International Building Code per section 1604, general design requirements. Staff would recommend that the following commercial structures be exempt from structural calculations. Number 1 is one-story conventional light frame construction per section 2308 of the 2006 International Building Code. Number 2, wood pole barns not to exceed 4,500 square foot and 12 foot tall, not listed in the 2006 International Building Code. And 3, S1 or S2 storage unit buildings, 10,000 square feet or less. The recommended action would be to please approve recommendations for staff to move forward with creating an ordinance to exempt the following items from the submittal of structural calculation requirements per 2006 International Building Code per section 1604.4 analysis. And we would just add an exception to section 1604.4 to read, structural calculations will not be required to be submitted for any of the following buildings. 1 would be a one-story building constructed in compliance with section 2308. Plan shall bear the seal of a Colorado registered professional engineer. 2, a one-story S2 occupancy enclosed parking garage without any habitable spaces, constructed in accordance with the Colorado chapter of the International Code Council Pole Barn Guide. Plan shall bear the seal of a Colorado registered professional engineer. 3, a one-story U occupancy constructed in accordance with the Colorado chapter of the International Code Council Pole Barn Building Guide. Plan shall bear the seal of a Colorado registered professional engineer. And 4, a one-story building, 10,000 square foot or less. It could be either an S1 or an S2 occupancy, limited to storage only without any habitable spaces. Plan shall bear a seal of the Colorado registered professional engineer. And I've also put an attachment from the Colorado chapter of the ICC, the Pole Barn Building Guide, which it did not come out through the chapter until 2015.
Thank you. Any questions of council? Mr. Meisner?
Thanks for your work on this, Kathy, but mainly you need to at least educate me. I'll ask some questions if anybody wants to jump in. Number 1, give me an example of what is that?
An example of a structural
one-story conventional light frame construction.
Oh, okay, so like on 15th Street right now, right by Hildebrand, there's an office building there, and they're adding that addition onto it.
Okay.
Conventional light frame construction would basically be like framing a house. So they're adding an addition to that, which is just light frame construction.
And is that got occupants in it?
It does. It does, but it has all its braced wall lines. It follows shear factors out of the code book. There's information in the code book that they could follow to build that would meet the requirements if it's one story.
Whenever I get to building my garage, where does that fit?
This doesn't fit with you. You live in a single-family residence.
It's
And-
detached.
Right, but this is just for commercial buildings only. This is not for residential.
Do they, okay, thank you. And item number 2, do they make steel pole barns?
Not to my knowledge. But they're coming up with new things every day, so.
They obviously make steel frame buildings that can be used as a barn. But a pole barn is in my mind, is talks specifically about the construction materials, the poles used to construct the barn. Is that right? Is that how you?
Correct. A pole barn is not something that's ever done through the code requirements. They don't acknowledge it because they're usually built for agriculture. They're not a real structural safe building. They're built out of poles and purlins run across them. And then they usually just have metal attached. There's usually no floor in them. They usually house hay for barns, or they have agriculture equipment in them. That's what they were originally designed for.
Without spilling the beans, somebody built what I thought was a pole barn to use as a garage on Fields Central, couple blocks off of East Main, 3 or 4 or 5 years ago. Does that ring a bell? It's on the north side or the west side of the street.
It could be, it could be. I don't think I was involved in that one, but we have more and more pole barns. We've always accepted them in a residential application because they're usually used for a detached garage where somebody wants to house something.
Okay.
But now we're running into problems that people want to build these big pole barns because they're cheaper to build, which is true, but then they want to make it an ADU later, or they want to put business office space in them. And pole barns aren't really structurally sound to house people inside of the buildings for a long period of time.
Okay. When we talk about, what's the difference between S1 and S2? I'm sure that's described somewhere, but for elementary purposes.
There could be storage units. It depends on the level of hazard of your storage units. This is basically a design for somebody that wants to build storage units so you can go rent a space and put your information or all your clothing or household goods in. And it could be designed either under an S1 or an S2. It depends on the level and the square footages of the storage units.
So I thought I read somewhere about a reference to the size of storage units in Canyon City. How did we come up with a 10,000 square foot?
At that time, the previous city administrator asked me to see what the exact square footages of ones we have here in Canyon City, and that was approximately, I went to the Highway 50 plans when they built those storage units out there, and all of those were 10,000 square foot or less. On an average, almost all of them, except I think Don Deal built one that was 21,000 square foot. He has a real large one.
So what's the significance of having the 10,000 square feet in there?
Just so they don't build anything bigger. I mean, they could if it's just for storage units only. My significant on that is okay, so if you're talking storage units, we also have people, trying to think, let's use for an example Mayflower. they have a huge hub in Utah, in Salt Lake City, where they store everything, but they may have a facility that's 75,000 square foot it's all open space, and they put everybody's stuff in this open space. So if we went with no figure, then a person like that could come in here and build whatever size they would like to build without any structural calculations.
And so, but I think that's the key. All these three categories, if they fall within this category, are less than the square footage and stuff like this, don't require structural calculations. If it's bigger, it does, right? That's what the question that
Yes.
we're
Right.
being asked to.
But my concern is that we're using a guideline to establish structural calculations, and the guideline that we're using to determine whether it does or does not need structural calculations has absolutely nothing to do with the structural calculations. It has to do with the average size of the units in Canyon City, and that seems to be apples and pears as a guideline as to whether it does or not. I could understand if you said that typically above 10,000 square feet, we have certain stress factors that would be necessary to have structural calculations. But it just seems like we've, with all due respect, we've not arbitrarily, but we've picked a number to differentiate yay or nay that has nothing to do with the structural integrity of a building. Is that correct?
That's correct, but that would be determined by the engineer. Again, those structural calculations and their shear factors are all determined by the engineer creating the plans. So when the process starts, an engineer has a design format which they go by. They have structural calculations. In order to build your plans, what they do is they do structural calculations. Some of the older engineers still do their calculations on pen and paper. Others use engineered programs, but they should have all their structural calculations as they are designing your plans, whether it's a 5,000 square foot building or whether it's a 30,000 square foot building.
Help me out, John.
Okay, so that leads me to my question. So my question is concerning the requirement to have a professional engineer sign off on the plans. So if a professional engineer signs off on the plans, if I understood you correctly, they're going to do the structural calculations because otherwise they're not performing something that the practice of civil engineering requires. In other words, the structural calculations. So if we require a professional engineer to sign off on these three exemptions, they're still going to do structural calculations.
They're just not going to turn them in, though.
They have the structural engineer, the plans will have to have the seal of a professional engineer.
Correct.
So
But
if they don't have to turn them in, how do you know that
We
they don't have to turn
know.
in the plans? Or they just have to show you like on my trusses, you needed to see the little stamp? Is that, I mean, I turn in my truss
The
plans?
engineer would just stamp the plans, just like your engineer stamped your trusses. And then we would accept those plans. In the commercial world, they've always required that engineer provide his structural calculations. So the plan reviewer can go through those calculations and say, okay, this belongs to this section, this looks good, it was calculated appropriately. This one looks good, this is to this section. That's the purpose in the commercial building code, to be able to, make sure that those calculations meet. From time to time, we have run across calculations that don't meet. I mean, I do just reviewing house plans for residential. I have an engineered software. We use StruCalc. And even though the engineer has designed that foundation, I always check his beams. And there's been several times the beams don't meet. So I call the engineer and ask him, and he'll say, oh, thank you for doing that. He says, I missed putting that pier in the middle there, and it's way overspan. So it's really, not a bad tool, but to have the structural calculations,
So will you continue to do, if I heard you correctly, for these three categories, if someone submits an application under one of these categories that does not have to provide structural calculations, will you still do the structural calculations?
no, they won't be done. It'll just be stamped by the engineer, because these will be all commercial buildings. This is only commercial buildings.
Oh, except for the wood pole barns, which are not commercial buildings.
Well,
Wood pole
no,
barns are
but they
not
would
commercial.
like to do this standard for the 4,500 square foot with just a professional engineer stamping off on it and not providing any calculations.
Okay, so in the building guide that you provided us for wood pole barns, there on page 2 in the bottom right, it says, where allowed by the jurisdiction, this pole barn guide may be used without the need for any additional engineering when all of the following apply. And then there's several factors there. So that would be the reason for not requiring the structural engineering calculations then, right?
No, and if you read this here is for a barn no larger than 1,280 square feet. And then it has to meet your wind and snow loads. This one does meet our snow loads. This came up with in 2015 through International Code Council of the Colorado chapter. I don't know that this 90 miles an hour would meet ours, because they took this out of the 2015 code, and they have redesigned the wind speeds in the 2015 to what the 2006 is. We are on fastest mile and 3-second gust in the 2006, and they have changed that to 1 straight now. And to what I have reviewed, our area would be at 115 miles per hour. So this here wouldn't meet our design standards. So it would still have to be stamped by an engineer.
If we required it.
Yes.
Right now, we have the option of not requiring it.
Well, we have not required it in residential applications. In the last, I'm going to say 3 years, pole barns have become really big because they are very cheap to build. And that's why a lot of people are wanting to go with them. This pole barn construction, this just came out in 17, so it's not that old. So as long as they would build way under, but most of the pole barns that we have seen are 2,000 square foot or bigger. So they've all been stamped by a registered design professional.
You said 2,000 feet?
Yeah. That's for residential.
If I were to apply for a permit tomorrow for my pole barn, would you give me this guide?
I could, but we're not on the 2015 code. That's where it makes it difficult too, but we can use this as a guideline. There is no problems with it. I would hesitate handing it out because it's approved method by ICC, so I don't have any troubles. The only problem I would have is to research the 90 miles per hour on here, what this is saying it can only go up to.
I guess where I'm going is back to my project. I get confused sometimes when I get involved with some of the issues that we have with building. And then I go back and look at all the pre-meetings that I had with you and all the pictures and diagrams and stuff that you presented to me and saying, this is what has to be done. And I'm intrigued with this guide from a standpoint that it seems to be pretty straightforward in terms of, here's the particulars you got to meet, and if you do that, things are going to go good. I would like to see when possible, I would like to see something like this presented with every building permit within reason. I mean, we can't tell them how to build a building, but a lot of the information, I'd have to go back through my packet to see all the pictures and diagrams that you gave me. But just generally, I would like to see some kind of a guide that's published by the building department, that's given to the permittee prior to the signing of the permit, of saying, these are the guidelines that we're both going to be working under. And it would seem to me like that would help us get some clarity in terms of some of the problems that we seem to run across. Does that make sense?
But one of the issues, though, is that if you follow this guide, if you wanted to build a pole barn and you followed this guide, you'd still have to have your plans, chopped by a
Right.
professional
No,
engineer.
we're talking about, right, I mean, this is.
So my point is, then this guide is no longer applicable, because the professional engineer will not use this guide to design your pole barn. So understand what I'm saying? The issue is the requirement to have the drawings chopped by the professional engineer. If you don't have to do that, then you can use this guide. But if you have to do it, then this guide doesn't really matter, because they're going to do their own calculations under the standards for the practice of civil engineering in the state, I believe.
So,
And this guide is only good for residential applications.
okay,
It tells you that in the corner on the first page, down in the
on
corner
page 3
of the pole
of the
barn
pole
guide?
barn construction, I mean, you're still inspecting the pole barn?
Yes.
And would you use page 3 as a guideline for some of those inspections that you're doing?
Yes, once they're approved. So
What-
if we handed this out to somebody, this application, for their pole barn and they're building one, and this would meet all of our guidelines, it would be reviewed first. And once it met all the guidelines, then it would be stamped for approval, they'd be issued a permit, and then when we go out to inspect, we would inspect it to whatever guidelines was approved on this handout.
It just seems to me that some of the projects that I've unfortunately been involved in, as we move through the project, there winds up being areas that the building department, or code enforcement, however you're looking at that, identifies in the project that we're 2 months into the project, and maybe rightfully so, somebody says, oh, by the way, we missed this. And I've never heard that term used, but here's another requirement you have to meet. And there seems to be some frustration when people will say, if I had known that 2 months ago, it would have been much easier for me on the project, versus 90 days into the project that you're now telling me that I have to meet this requirement. And considering the process that I went through on my simple project, I find that confusing, but I see this document as being enlightening in that whole process, that we're identifying everything up front. And the more that we can do that in this whole process, then I think the opportunity for the building enforcement and the contractor to work as a team becomes much more viable and possible, versus some of the challenges we have where I It would be nice that we could progress to a point where a contract, and I'm sure they do this now in some situations, where a contractor could call the building department and have the building department show up on site and be somewhat enthusiastic that the building department is showing up to address some issues and correct some problems versus identifying flaws in the whole process. And I hopefully I've said that right, but I want to move more towards a team effort in getting the building constructed within the parameters that we all agreed to beforehand versus this seemingly ever-changing mechanism as we're moving through the project. And that's my biggest complaint that I hear is things keep changing. You come in and inspect today, and we identify some issues, and we correct those issues, and you come in next week, and you find other issues that should have been identified months ago. And I'm somewhat digressing, but it's the same concept of what we're trying to accomplish. And if a guide helps accomplish that, I think we need to try to move in that direction. But I don't know that it does, considering the engineering complications.
So and I appreciate what you said, and I think that's a concern that I have, as being someone who was in a lot of highly regulated industries. The things that would drive me batty in those industries and dealing with regulations and regulators is, the more than one bite at the apple syndrome. In other words, when a review is done, it should be thorough, it should be complete, it should be timely, but it should be one review, and it should not be the oh, by the way syndrome. And so, but that, we're not really dealing with that issue here, directly with that issue,
Right, that's why I say,
Yeah.
I'm digressing, but
So let's say I wanted to build a residential pole barn, and it was below the 40 by 32 that this building guide covers. If I didn't have to have the plans sealed by a professional engineer, I just follow this checklist, this guideline, which shows me what the requirements are. Okay, if I have to have it sealed by a professional engineer, this goes out the window. I'm no longer then building my pole barn. What I'm doing is I'm going to a professional engineer to have plans and specifications drawn up for the size building that I want, and this is moot. This is no longer in play. And so to me, it's the requirement for a professional engineer sign off on a pole barn, as we have it identified here, not to exceed 4,500 square feet, means that you can never use a guide like this.
okay, I'll buy that. Well, I don't buy it, but I understand it.
Well, in the IBC anyhow, and this is all this would pertain to would be the commercial aspects of construction. It wouldn't pertain to the residential. Only the IBC, which is the building code, which is the commercial. We also have an IRC, which is the residential code. It's completely separate. This here that we're dealing with, that we're asking for, is only strictly the IBC for commercial applications.
So I'm going to ask questions. I don't know that I can ask them. The most recent pole barn episode that we've had, if this change were in place, what impact would it have on that process? What have it had on that process?
None. They would just process it. They would review it. If we have this in process, they could go ahead and go through their plan review. It would probably be a simple process because it's stamped by the engineer.
Did they have that?
Yes, they did have that.
But as I understand it, the complication was the additional engineering calculations that needed to be provided. Is that
Right,
correct?
and the engineer couldn't provide that.
And this-
But, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Under this new process, those structural calculations for that project would not have been required, is that correct?
Correct.
So it potentially would have just blown right through the system, potentially.
Well, it would have to meet certain other requirements of the IBC as far as there's restrooms required. I mean, there's a few things, even under the S, occupancy restrooms are required, but he would have been covered under that because he has a home there that already has an accessible restroom in it that's within 600 feet of where he wants to place his building.
So the complication that we had with a storage unit, losing track of time, 6, 8 months ago, would have that was larger than this S1, S2?
Both of them were, yes.
So that wouldn't have applied there. And again, we had engineering calculations that needed to be submitted. That was a difficulty and additional costs and what have you.
Yes, and I don't know what engineers charge for their calculations.
Right.
That part I don't know. There's almost all buildings that are metal buildings because they are not also listed in the code book. That's why they're always designed by a professional.
Right.
That's why calculations were always required, especially if you're going to make business office spaces, whatnot on the interior.
So to you and John, I mean, is it possible relative to item 3 on page, whatever it is, in regards to S1 and S2 storage buildings, is it possible to have a threshold that is relative to structural integrity versus a number that's relative to the average size of a storage unit? I just have a real hang-up with 10,000, even though 10,000 was based on 85% of the storage units, it's still somewhat of an arbitrary figure relative to structural integrity and the requirement for structural integrity, additional structural integrity measures. It would be nice that if we had a figure that maybe was, I'm going to say a word, architecturally based, that said, you know, when you go over 12,583 square feet, that puts you into a different level of a building. I mean, I just have a problem with 10,000. That seems to be an arbitrary figure.
And I could get a hold of an engineer, several engineers,
Okay.
and see how they felt about that, coming up with a different calculation.
I mean, if it's 7,500 feet, I don't have a problem because it's based on some technical reference versus an arbitrary figure out here.
Okay,
And I think as staff, that is what we'd prefer to see as well.
yes. I really like that, actually.
So just to clarify, this is under the residential code.
Yes.
What we're dealing with today is really commercial code.
Correct.
And because of those differences, this wouldn't apply anyway.
No, but I wanted to show you what has come out and what, because we do have so many residential pole barns coming through. In fact, they issued a permit today for one for 4,200 square feet.
This is a really great permitting process because it lays it all down in black and white, what you have to do. And with perhaps the exception of an engineer's seal or chop.
I just really like this.
Yeah.
This
And
concept.
we have all these building guides out on our
Okay.
website for different. The only reason this one isn't is because it was in the 2015. But I'd be more than glad, I would accept this for somebody that wants to build, but I do need to check out to make sure it meets our wind speeds.
Right, yeah,
And if it doesn't, I could talk to an engineer again and see maybe if we could crop it down, if we needed to crop it down to 800 square feet or 1,000 to meet our wind speeds, would it still be structurally safe to use this guide?
Yeah, I just think the concept of the guide would help. It just kind of lays everything out ahead of time. It's a nice and black and white, and I think the average Joe, this makes sense, or it did to me.
What did you agree to here?
Well, where I'm at is, aside from the 10,000 square foot limitation, aside from all of my seemingly conflicts that I have with the building department, I know I support what you're trying to do in terms of streamlining that process for very specific types of projects that seemingly from the construction contractor end makes sense. And I think it's a step forward, other than the 10,000.
Right, I think your example is, it seems to me a storage unit like I see them, it's just a repetition of constant. They could go on for a mile, so square footage doesn't matter. What you were talking about with Southwest, that's a warehouse.
Right.
They can call it anything they want, that's a warehouse. So I think that would fall a different guideline, just me, I'm not a builder. The other thing is that we talk about commercial, we have other zone types for pole barns, residential. We have other zone types, we have industrial. Would that fit in an industrial zone?
Yes.
Would it fit in, obviously it would fit into we have a very small amount of agricultural zoning in this town. Very little, fit there?
Yes.
R1, R2, R3, R4? As long as it has an R in front of it, it'd work?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, I just wanted to make that clear, because they could, technically, you could go into, put it in an industrial zone. When you're talking commercial, then commercial, which has it has a glare of having people using it as well, in and out sort of stuff, different type of zoning, different requirements than because of that public use. Could be public use. Okay. So yeah, my mind is that if you talk about a true storage unit, it seems like that's a repetition that is the same thing over and over and over again, and square footage is almost a moot point.
The 10,000?
Yeah, the 10,000.
Well, yeah, but it's still there. I
Well,
mean, are we
but-
talking 10,000 as an individual
I
building?
wouldn't
or
want it. I
collectively?
don't know if we need it. I mean, you're going to take a look at that, and
Oh, I see what you're
if
saying.
whether you got 2 units or 100 in a row, same type of construction, they've got barriers between them, and they're true storage units. It's not a warehouse, it's a true storage units with barriers to protect people's goods in certain sequestered areas. I don't think 10,000 is necessary, so.
So in taking on that question, if we move forward as it's written, where we have S1 or S2 with 10,000 or less, then you would also have a S1 or S2 10,000 or more, 10,000 or one more. Is
It
it,
would require structural calculations.
I mean, a category. You'd have 2 categories of S1 and S2s.
Well, it would still be listed under S1 and S2. It should be S1 and S2, because you can build storage units under both of those types of codes, defining them out. They can be a storage unit 1. One's a moderate storage, and the other one's low hazard storage. So it depends on what kind of storage and things you're building for.
So, Mr. Mayor, is your suggestion that we should remove the 10,000?
Yeah, if it's a true storage unit, I think my narrow thinking is you have a unit that people put their goods in, and then you have a wall which should be structural support of some type possibly, and you could do that forever and still have the same, why limit to 10,000? Now, in the case of what Kathy had said with a warehouse, I can see that. That's a warehouse. They bring their boxes in there and they stick it. That's a different category altogether. That's what it seems, I don't know, I'm not a
And it's
builder.
actually not a different category. It's still considered an S1 or an
Is it
S2.
really?
And that's why I was afraid,
Yeah.
and that's why I was trying to put a limit in there, so somebody didn't come in and want to just build a great big storage. I mean, if they did, okay, but I think we should have the structural calculations on something of that size.
I agree with what the mayor's saying, but I also agree with the concept that if you could at least do a little bit of research with everybody else's consensus to see if there's a technical reference point of says, below this we're okay, above this we're okay. Whatever that figure is. I mean, if it turns out to be 5,000, that engineers in general say, you get above that size of building, we need structural calculations.
Okay.
Or what maybe other towns do. I mean, I hate to what does Pueblo or Colorado Springs do?
Yeah.
I hate to, maybe that's easier than trying to go talk to an engineer. I would find it that way, but anyway.
Actually, I
Sorry,
talk to
John, I-
engineers every day.
Okay, yeah, I know. I don't know, maybe we could mimic what they have and don't have to reinvent the wheel, whatever you're comfortable with, I think.
Which actually, relative to the recommended action, is item number 4. Is that correct? Because I keep making reference to item number 3, but it's actually item number 4.
Yes, it's item number 4.
So you'll clarify that for us?
Yes, I will try to get that taken care of before week's end, come up with, I'll talk to several engineers. In fact, I need to talk to one tomorrow. I'll ask him what his take is on, just for storage unit only buildings. And then I'll look a little closer at a couple things in the book to make sure that, like Preston was talking, he would think that would be considered a warehouse. And where in our code book, it's not, and I just wanted to be safe with that, so somebody didn't come in and want to build a 100,000 square foot building.
Right.
Well, they maybe could do that now, come in and tell us we're going to build a 100,000 square foot warehouse, and then we find out they're putting storage in it. So, and I believe if you're going to build something that big, you are going to have calculations. It'd be nuts not to.
Yeah.
Right.
Go ahead.
I think one final question. With the residential pole barn permits seemingly on the uprise or the increase, do we have any kind of a disclaimer or that people are signing, that they understand that you're building a pole barn and that cannot be used for any future habitable purposes?
We do not have anything on that.
From my perspective, depending on the legal end of it, it would seem to me like, considering some of the problems we've had in the past relative to those issues, that it would be nice on that original building permit that there was that, I'm going to call it a disclaimer, but acknowledgement that this is a pole barn and cannot be used in 35 years or 6 months for habitable purposes, so that we've very clearly up front stated, this is what it's for.
No conversion.
You can't convert it.
Just the one that's being built that I issued the permit for today, I told you it was, I think it's 4,180 square foot. 1,280 square foot, he wants to make living space. So his engineer did engineer correctly. She did make him do a monolithic slab. It's a low slab with the R value to meet all the energy code requirements, and it has to be built with 2x6 walls. So she did take into consideration that that's going to be habitable space that he wants to finish in the future. It's not right now. And then the rest of his building will be designed as his pole barn.
Right, and I think that that particular situation would never be a problem in the future. It's the other ones where,
They want to
you know,
turn it into.
I buy her place and I see a nice pole barn and then I want to put, my man cave in there and, I mean, seriously, those are the types of obstacles that we run against is that, you want to do a little bit of a conversion and all of a sudden you realize you can't. And that's the only reason I bought it.
Right.
So you have taken that as a something to investigate, which is how to get a legal release into this process, so for pole barns, so that people know
That's
that.
my preference. Just,
I don't know if the release is quite the
I don't
right
know what
term.
it
It's
is,
not a
but-
release, it's really a warning.
A disclaimer of some
Acknowledgement.
kind from.
Yeah.
something to just be upfront with people that
Yeah.
in 5 years, the mayor can hold it up and say, here it is. We told you.
Well, if you're going to do that, then I would think that it should be recordable, because I will pick it up on my title work.
Wow.
That's
You
fair,
know, I
because
mean,
the new owner's going to see that, oops, I can't do that. And
I don't know what would be required, but I mean,
What
those
you-
are the things that we
Well,
need.
a lot of people want to turn their detached garages all of a sudden into ADUs. They even want to do their sheds.
Right.
And when we go out there, it's like, well, you can't, because any type of livable space has to be on a permanent foundation.
Right,
And a pole barn does not have a permanent foundation.
right.
Oh, okay, well, that's another thing.
Is that going to take care of?
I like the idea of a legal acknowledgement. That's-
Something, I just,
Yeah.
I mean,
And maybe recordable, I mean.
we
that's what our
inevitably
attorneys do.
run into those problems where, 5 years from now, we get a change in use and it's our fault.
Yeah, your dynamics change drastically when you start recording against properties.
Okay.
And that almost comes like slander of title. You want to do that. But point well taken, there's no foundation. You can't do it because there's no foundation. Maybe that's something they ought to be told. Chances are they know that, but anyway. Any other questions? I think the direction then is to go forward with your recommendations and with the possible exception that maybe look into that square footage thing,
Okay.
maybe how they do it there. So, well, thank you. Anybody has any
Yeah,
questions?
absolutely, thanks.
Yeah, thanks. And any other thing you can find to simplify this, we'd appreciate.
Do what?
Anytime.
All
It
right.
makes it simplified for me as well.
I know, makes it easier for you. Well, let's continue.
Yeah, I
Okay?
mean, yeah, that's the objective of
Yeah.
all of this, is to make, like I say, I would like to see a situation where contractors look at the building department, as in my situation. Whenever I came across a problem, I felt really comfortable calling you and I can't remember his name,
Greg.
Greg, about just a question, to get an answer relative to building, not advice, but just saying, hey, can I do this? And I felt comfortable doing that, and I would hope that at some point in the future, we could get contractors on the same page with the building department, that we're all here to be successful.
Okay. Thank you, Kathy. Appreciate
Thank you.
it. Thank
Thanks,
you.
Kathy.
Ryan, we're adjourned.